Fluid Futures, Children of Empire. And to discuss the topic I have with me Robin Peckham, editor-in-chief of Leap magazine, artist Lantian, based in Dubai, Tsang, an artist based in Los Angeles, who's recently just finalized and presented Doi Lan at Spring Workshop here in Hong Kong. And we have Oscar Murillo, artist who's based between the UK and Colombia. So it's a real pleasure to have these artists here with me today. And just to sort of introduce the frame, the thinking behind this panel actually comes from two things. The first is an exhibition that happened in Antwerp at the Museum of Contemporary Art, entitled Don't You Know Who I Am? Art After Identity Politics. It was curated by Anders Kruger and Nav Hack, and in fact Nav Hack was here last year speaking with Guan Xiao and Wu Tang about that very exhibition. And Oscar and Wu were both included in that show. The show intended to explore the ways in which a new generation of artists have, and I quote the curators, outgrown theoretical and visual codes that were too often focused on representations of the self, the body, and more than anything expressed a desire for social visibility, which was sort of referencing the sort of identity politics of the 80s and the 90s. In which various groups were defined themselves along political, economic, or social lines such as race, ethnicity, gender, or sexuality in order to enhance their visibility and overcome marginalization. And I'm quoting the curatorial text again. So in so many ways, what the show interrogated was how artists today appear more interested in identities in the plural, or they're more interested in sort of becoming or understanding or expressing a sort of complexity, which, as the curator stated, the art system has not always been able or willing to accommodate. So, I mean, it's sort of perfect that we're going to be talking about contradiction and complexity in an art fair, which itself is also, some might argue, a space of contradiction and complexity. And the second thing is the issue of Leap, which I edited with Robin here, Children of Empire, which is really trying to start a conversation as to how we might find new languages or new ways to talk about or respond to something that's actually come up quite a lot in this Salon program, but also in conversations throughout the art world, which is how do we deal with the complexities of our time, and as bodies, how do we deal, as bodies who don't sort of necessarily fit into the normative definitions or structures that have been offered to us, how we might transcend those. So for instance, I can talk for myself, I'm Eurasian, so how would I sort of find a position between the two nation states that apparently I am connected to? And this is why I'm very excited to have everyone here. And to begin, I did want to just start by asking Wu and Oscar to describe the work that they showed at Muka as a sort of starting point to get into the conversation. And of course, we don't have visuals, but I'm going to give a little shout out to artist Raed Yassin, who always says it's much more interesting not to show visuals because then the audience has to imagine as much as the artist has to describe. So I wonder if Wu, you could really start by talking about the work that you showed and why, and also how you felt being put in an exhibition that was sort of framed around transcending identity politics.
The film that I showed is called Shape of a Right Statement, and it's a short 5-minute performance that I did. It was, I guess, I was thinking of it at the time as a kind of a drag performance where I was re-speaking a manifesto by an autism rights activist named Amanda Baggs. I was really drawn to, I guess, her statement about how language defines whether we are seen as people. And for me to appropriate her voice, which was also a voice that was coming through a computerized speech generation device, I guess, for me, introduced a lot of complexity. And so I guess that's really what the work is about, and often what my practice is about, is working with voices and what does it mean to speak, for someone else, or for whom do you speak? And these questions are always very relevant, I guess.
And that was actually, the Shape of a Right Statement was filmed in the Silver Platter, which formed the sort of that was the focus of your first 2012 feature documentary, Wildness. And this was I wonder if you could explain a little bit about Wildness, but while you do that, also talk about how your experience in this bar really informed your understanding of what it means to speak for and of a place, to speak for others, and also to find certain solidarities within such complex sites as the Silver Platter.
Wildness is a documentary about a historic trans bar in Los Angeles that's still alive and well and has been, since the early 60s, a safe haven for a lot of trans people, LGBT community, mostly immigrating from Mexico and Central America. And it's a place that I actually found home in, and maybe perhaps in an unlikely way, in the sense that it's not directly the community that I'm quote unquote a part of, but it's also coming from a immigrant family, a Chinese descent, and being also transgender. It was a place that I found community. And so the film is very much about the complexity of community. And I think the gay question or the LGBT question is an interesting one because it implies a lot of assumptions about we're all gay, so it's okay. There's no power dynamics through that. We can just all be here, like a Cheers, everyone knows your name kind of bar scenario. And it's absolutely not true. There's all kinds of problems, I guess. And so that's what the film explores.
And what's interesting is that you came to the Silver Platter and you said you found a home there, and it was 2005 when you moved to LA. And that was just after your trip to China, which really informed your project here at Spring Workshop. And you did talk about your experience in going to China. You were sort of trying to find your roots because you'd been sort of an outsider in Massachusetts in the 80s. But then when you went to China, you sort of experienced a kind of, I think you called it devastating displacement or something like this.
Yeah, actually, the film that I have here right now in Hong Kong is a project, Dulia, and it's it's a project that's 10 years in the making, and it really started 2005, the year before I moved to LA. As you just described, this trip that I took to China that was very personally significant for me. It's interesting. I think it took me a long time to get to the place where I could make this work because over the past 10 years, I've always worked with language, and actually just recently published a book called Not in My Language, and it has to do with the fact that I've always been drawn to working with this impossibility of language or translation and speaking in other languages. And so for me to actually deal with my father's mother tongue, and it was this sort of challenge to me. Could I confront my own so-called ethnic authenticity? I think especially in the context of the visual arts, where I have this it's sort of a joke, but I often think about this figure of the international man of mystery, which is something a lot of something I think that the art world is really seduced by, this idea of there's an interesting essay written by Lee Solskin about the phenomenon of the based-in artist, and this sort of wanting to not sort of feed the expectations, I think, of the art world of being an international man of mystery, I guess. I could go on more about it, but I think, I'd love to open up the conversation to everyone.
Well, speaking of men of mystery, I think that's a good point to bring in Oscar. Oscar? First of all, of course, I'm curious to know how you felt about being in that exhibition at MUCA, because it was really interesting how you interrogated it. It was sort of using the factory as a way to explain complexity through exchanges, I think, and sort of production, exchange, and consumption. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm also very curious about how, your practice, and I'm thinking particularly about the exhibition that you had at David's Werner. I think it was in 2014 when you installed the factory making Choco Mellows, in which you brought in workers from Colombia, and you were referencing the factory the kind of factory that your parents had worked in. Your practice has been really interesting in terms of how others have interpreted you. And somehow have sometimes bypassed the practice itself and the work. And I'm so curious how you've kind of mediated that or managed that.
Yeah. Hello? Before I begin, I think it's very important, and I think this maybe perhaps has a lot to do with your statement. But I think for there to be a valid and open conversation that transpasses the current still dominant colonial situation in which we live in from a Western context, the West as a salivating penis, pretty much ready to penetrate the rest of the world like they have been for 500 years or more. We, in the context of the art world, need to get rid of people like Hans Ulbricht, Cecilia Lemani, Massimiliano Giorni, and all these curators and individuals that keep the status quo. And here in Asia, Latin America is unfortunately a terrible place that is lagging behind, because they still very much want to follow father. But I think here in Asia there's an opportunity to merge enterprise and the empower people, some like maybe Robin Peckham, who's been diligent enough to embrace and be embraced in the context of Asia, his partner Venus Lau, and perhaps a lot of these young collectors who, instead of being so preoccupied with being photographed in places like Tadla, they should take the opportunity to empower intellectuals from this diaspora, and I think this is a very special moment and should not be wasted. There is no point in me talking about the show Muka. Unfortunately, the only way to have a conversation in the context of Europe or America is always under father, which is the oppressor. Being Latin American, I grew up in London, and of course I'm not denying the fact that a European context and American context was able to empower my thought and educate myself, but I think it's due that us here in this audience, and I'm not denying a cross-cultural exchange, but I think it's due that, given the commercial power and the West, again, a salivating penis, should be the right moment to increase and to empower ourselves in a cultural capital, and I think that's what's really missing to create a very equal exchange. Why should a Western cultural situation be always the one that has to be embraced and taken in? On the other hand, one can say, well, there's nothing else, or there's no other that's challenging, and that's precisely the point, and that's why we're here.
That's fascinating, and I want to bring in Lantian and Robin to this, but first of all, Oscar, I am so curious if you could talk a little bit about what you're doing on stage.
Another curator is Simon Castells.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about Oscar, is this an intervention? Is this a response to the situation? Because when you talk about having to resist the sort of father or the Western father, of course, we're here in Art Basel, which in some ways you could call a Western construct as well.
I'm saying, Art Basel is almost representative of the equator. You have Art Basel in Miami, you have Art Basel in Central Europe, although the Swiss are not Europeans. They want to play the world and be the equal. They want to serve everybody. Then we have Art Basel here in Asia, and I'm like I said, I'm not denying the need for a cross-cultural exchange. I'm not saying, we need to reject. I'm saying that this is an opportunity for a diaspora, Latin American, although unfortunately in Latin America is very weak, African, to really stand up and, make ourselves count in the context of culture. Yes, there is commercial capital, there is natural resources, there is ecology, but it is culture. Culture since the Renaissance has been the trump card. Religion.
Yeah.
And the exports of culture. Look at Cuba right now. I was reading the news. The Rolling Stones rock Cuba is rape.
Robin, I wonder if you could respond to this, because actually this is very relevant to the issue of LEAP that we just worked on. We had Walter Mignolo, who sort of raised the specter of the Bandung Conference in 1955, which was actually mentioned by Thomas Berghaus as well. And something that struck me in this program this year was, I think it was twice, it was Tatsuo Miyajima said that if we could put an artist into the UN, the world would be a better place. And of course, I think that what Walter was talking about when he was reviving this notion of the Bandung is, and what this issue very much is about, is how can we find a kind of solidarity amongst us. But also one of the provocations we were making was we're all children of empire. So regardless of whether we were on the side of the oppressor, let's say, of the last 500 years, even that side, let's say, has also been somehow colonized. So I wonder how you would respond to Oscar's points.
Absolutely. No, I think that's totally the most important thing about the way we approach this issue, but also our kind of project in general as a magazine, myself as a curator, is that we're in such a point of kind of intertwining cultures, inextricably connected ways of living. You talk about being Eurasian and kind of living in biracial, bicultural family configurations and queer family configurations, and this kind of half media, half real way that we live now. There's no point ever in trying to trace back to some point of purity. I don't think with the new Chinese nationalism, I don't think there's any difference essentially from the Aryan superiority movement in the US. I think it's just a totally uninteresting thing to talk about. The much more pressing issue is to figure out where exactly we are and how we can go forward from that position respectfully, without stepping on each other's toes, but also kind of pulling each other into a new kind of context. I think, personally, so much of the way that you see the world is formed by your freshman year of college. And that moment for me was like right when queer theory did this really weird turn into like post-performativity, and identity politics got totally thrown out the window, and everything became about don't tell us who you are, get rid of the race, class, gender matrix, and talk about what you can do. And the idea was that everyone has the ability to take any course of action, regardless of where you're coming from, and so you have to privilege that forward motion rather than the looking back.
And that's actually a perfect moment to bring in Lantian, because Lantian wrote this beautiful sort of, I don't even know if it's a post-colonial road trip that you wrote with Uzma Rizvi, but I wonder how you would respond to what Oscar and Robin have just talked about, but of course I wonder if you could first introduce yourself, because your background is so inherently tied to this conversation, and it was also so tied to the story that you wrote, but also that exhibition Hassan Matar that you staged at Grey Noise. It was 2014, I think it was.
Yeah, I think Wu and Oscar bring up really interesting points that I would really like to spend some time unpacking. The first thing, you asked me to introduce myself. Yeah, so I'm an artist based in Dubai, from Dubai. I would consider myself as someone who belongs there, which is contentious to say if you know the place. But to to go back to what Oscar and Wu were saying, I feel like in the context of the Bai that I practice in, we have a lot of conversations about audience, who things are made for, right? You and I have also spoken about this, and immediately when Oscar starts talking about these sort of internationally roving satellite peoples and the markets that come along with them, this is something that we speak a lot about in Dubai, in which all of you folks arrive and stay in for a week out of every year. And so for the rest of the time, folks like myself and also Umar, who's sitting in the audience there, for the rest of the time, we speak about and think about what it means to make from that space, what it means to think about that place, what it means to try to voice that place, to articulate a particular kind of language that makes sense for that place, that is somehow invisible to exactly people like us, I guess, and so I think a lot of that is this kind of necessary politics of exclusion that comes about. Really the practice that happens there for me is several simultaneously that have different kinds of unraveling or travel differently. Like the first core audience is people that are from there. When I say from there, I mean what anthropologists call impossible citizens. So folks like myself, folks like Umar, and very many others who were born there or raised there and have this very sort of contingent kind of position there.
Just to interject, it's that you have to get a visa. There's a real process in terms of actually staying there.
Yeah, so Oscar, I think, brought up diaspora, right? So in Dubai, there are many folks for whom diaspora doesn't make sense because we haven't been permitted to arrive from which to feel a kind of nostalgic longing for what was left behind. Immigrant doesn't make sense because there's no recourse to assimilate in terms of policy. Yeah, interruptions, I guess. I've totally lost my previous train of thought, but I'm actually really grateful for interruptions, and I think there is something in there. I'm not sure how it's. I can't articulate it right now, but I'm really grateful for these kinds of interruptions. Like the drawing on the stage, even the omnipotent voice sort of warning against. It's like don't touch the artwork, right? It's like instructions on how to be the model neoliberal subject, right? Like how do you consume the thing? And so it's like really interesting to sit here, and it's like I am a little bit hungover from yesterday, and I'm not as articulate as I would like to be, and I'm actually really fascinated by that. I don't know if this is making any sense.
Yeah, no, this makes a lot of sense because I think I should probably tell everyone we didn't sort of prepare for this because I wanted it to be as spontaneous as possible because the whole intention of the conversation was, maybe to quote the title of Wu's work, is to find the shapes of right statements. And what I think is so interesting is how the way that we're talking, we're not even, I think the intention was of this issue, and I think with so many practices, is how to escape the reductions. And as you said, the sort of shaping of the neoliberal subject, or shaping people into forms that might not necessarily fit their own complexity. I'm curious how you guys are feeling about this conversation right now.
Yeah, before we continue, this is Yutaka Sone. It's a wonderful friend and almost like a mentor figure. We started a collaboration called Room Service, and what you were talking about earlier, the idea of what happens to the person or the individual that gets left over, the invisible figure, and the kind of, it's almost impossible like Robin was saying, to talk about purity. We're not talking about purity here. But it's almost impossible to... In the last 2 weeks, I've been wrestling with how meaningful and how significant and how much of a change can one make. Almost, and I guess the call for someone like Hans Obritz, someone like Simon Castells, Cecilia Alemani, Massimiliano Giorni, and all these individuals to be almost made redundant is because of this fleeting nature and lack of seriousness that they take and approach culture. Something like 89 plus is a joke because of the fact that it doesn't take into account the local context. The invisible can also be interpreted in the sense that what happens to the people that, for example, built this fair and the many workers that were here a week or 2 weeks before while installing. Some were falling asleep, they were very tired, and so on and so forth. But also, one cannot deny the fact that we live in a very complicated and fast world. So how does one reconcile that? So someone like Yutaka and I, we started this drawing collaboration called Room Service, which effectively means that wherever we find ourselves in the world, we lock ourselves into a hotel room and we call into room service to feed us, go for drinks, and we simply just draw. And again, the idea of disrupt or to try and slow down this idea of speed. A week ago, 2 weeks ago, I was supposed to be in Sydney, and I came to Hong Kong and got into the following leg of my trip, and on the plane, I flushed my British passport down the toilet, and I got myself arrested and detained in Sydney, got deported, had to go to Colombia and issue a temporary passport, flew back to Europe and came to Hong Kong. It wasn't, so this isn't about protest in like I want to reject my British identity. It was effectively causing a slight jarring situation, entropy. So to ways of one can find to slow down this very fast, expedient situation. And so going back to the idea of change. So all of us here, we deal in culture. We're in the art world, whether you like it or not. And so it is for this world in which we live in, which is a very small and minute world, but nevertheless bringing, a diversity of individuals from, finance, agriculture, sciences, and it is here that one should attempt to discuss the possibility of change within our own context, and for me that's why it's very urgent that we not talk about purity, but we talk about making ourselves count. The reason why I speak against Latin America is because Latin America, unfortunately, has not been able to step up, and the role of the commercial gallery is important, and it is within that context that one has the ability to infiltrate and get in there and make an explosion from within.
I want to stay with this idea of infiltration and put this to Wu and Lantian. in terms of how you both have navigated the art world as artists, because of course you've both kind of moved between spaces and places and contexts, or as such.
Well, I come maybe more from an activist background, and I guess for me being in the art world is, I mean, it's like it's not a real thing. I mean, it's like one more space to kind of have to navigate. It's not like a central space. And I think, actually something I was thinking about just now in this conversation is about, I think maybe, again, it comes from like sort of activist modes of working, but like how difficult it is to have a conversation because it's like it's about listening, and how hard it is to, or I guess like the reason listening is important is because it's about realizing that everyone speaks their own language and has their own way of understanding and expressing themselves. And so therefore, the idea of having a conversation with other people is about trying to create a space where we can all speak and express ourselves the way we want to, but also maybe have some sort of exchange about it. And that on a very fundamental level is challenging, not just because we're neoliberal subjects that are trying to perform, like behave a certain way or something, but also just because we have psychologies and we have personal histories and we have, there's so many layers to it. And so I guess for me, like language is always that thing that's like, it gets between that ability to connect and to understand intention, but also it's the thing through which I guess we kind of, otherwise we really are just like talking to ourselves, so.
I mean, this really I was actually part of an open platform at the Asia Art Archive that was hosted by Ishu, and they were the question was, what China? And Ingrid Chu talked about this notion of productive displacement. And, the whole conversation was basically talking about, even in the context of China, there is a sense of displacement, there is a kind of hybridity. There's always a need to start from the personal, or to start from the personal experience. And Lee, I wonder how you relate to that notion. I mean, given sort of your practice, how you have been kind of dealing with being an artist in Dubai and all of the issues that you've sort of faced as a result. And also, actually, I think you are kind of a sort of exemplar of productive displacement. You even turned the interruption into something glorious. So. Thanks.
So you've just reminded me, there's this geopolitics analyst named Afshin Molavi, who comes to Dubai quite a lot, and he was giving a talk a couple of weeks ago that I went to, and he said this thing that Dubai is the Hong Kong of India, which I really liked, and so I think it's also, we're talking about movements and not to get trapped in dialecticals, which very much comes from this colonial North Atlantic sort of area studies tradition for me, or maps onto that a little too effectively. And actually, speed is something, again, Oscar talked about speed. Speed is something that we talk a lot about in Dubai as well. The Gulf is in this midst of development, in which speed is projected as an aspiration towards an international that is actually really North Atlantic, right? So slowness is something that we try to talk about a lot as a way to, not so much in a dialectical mode to resist that, but to think about elasticity, to sort of to pull it loose. And I think the idea of that is to generate space for conversation, like we were saying.
And of course, that this idea of speed also relates to like the need to define. What are you? Who are you? And not allowing the space to really talk it out and shape it out. And I wanted to sort of, on that note, when you were talking about Dubai and how it has been kind of processed by this sort of acceleration, let's call it. I mean, Robin, this is a nice time to bring you in because, of course, you have such an overarching view. You yourself, this hybrid figure, who's the editor-in-chief of Leap, which is, of course, the international magazine of China, an American as well. And so I wonder if you could kind of, I was interested to have you on here because I thought you'd be an ideal person to kind of synthesize or maybe even sort of push forward the conversations that are occurring.
Yeah, I mean, my role with our issue was really essentially zero. For me, it's really interesting with the magazine, even when you're bi-monthly, putting out 6 issues a year, you get into really this rhythm of kind of doing the same thing over again because you have to do it for a deadline. You know, it's not like an exhibition where you can say, I'm not going to do it this month, let's take a break and do it in the fall instead. Like, it's got to come out for all of these systemic reasons. And so we decided kind of once a year, it's really nice to sort of take the thematic section of the magazine, the part that we're really building as not just kind of criticism, but an archive of what's happening in culture now, and hand that off to someone else to give ourselves an opportunity to get out of our chairs and kind of see what someone who we really respect in terms of thinking about these issues can do with that. And so it was amazing to have you come in and essentially, I mean, the way that we explain the magazine to this issue to our Chinese readers is to say that you've taken all of these disparate territories, so many of which insist that they were never colonized, which I think is a super important idea because, you know, postcolonialism is postcolonialism. The reason postcolonialism has very little intellectual traction in China, except for Taiwan, is because China insisted it was never colonized. I had a European history textbook in 8th grade written by Palmer, whatever history of Europe, and the section on Qing Dynasty China started that as China was rotting away like a stinky cheese from within, the rind was being chopped apart by the European armies. This was kind of the moment of the invasion of Beijing and all of that. So yeah, sure, we were never colonized, but it's not really an important assertion to make. And so it's interesting to take other places that were never colonized, like Russia, portions of the Middle East, portions of Southeast Asia, and to kind of draw a line through these places and say, okay, none of us were colonized, all of us were colonizers, and vice versa. And then how can you actually move past that in a way?
I mean, how can we actually move past that is sort of the question I think that this issue was proposing, and also the question that this discussion was kind of brought together, was arranged in order to sort of focus on, which is how do we go past that? And I think I'm just going to sort of wrap it up by asking each of you to sort of say what you think. How do we go past that which could be speed or, you know, the need to slow down or the need to sort of escape definitions that have defined us that come obviously from a sort of colonial past, or even the need to recognize the colonization of oneself, even if they don't one doesn't necessarily come from an explicitly colonized background. So maybe Oscar, you could begin.
I also forgot MoMA and the Tate. We need to eradicate. But I think, yes, we're saying, oh, this is the problem, this is where we come from. How do we move forward? I think to move forward is really for us to embrace capital, finance. I mean, I guess I am myself an incredibly, problematic artist. Here I am talking about culture, etc., when, my paintings are selling for X amount of money. But it's really that fact of finance, and that has allowed myself to be an infiltrator. Otherwise, would I have been able to do the Mercantile novel at Davis Werner? No. Would I have been able to do the performance that I did in Brazil? No. So we shouldn't be naive. Capital is important. I think the way to also be aware is that this doesn't happen overnight. A call for a formation and an evolution and development of, a kind of Eastern, again, not talking about purity. I mean, we are all hybrids here. is to say this is going to take a long time, and there's going to be a lot of mistakes, but we want to do it the way we want to do it. And a lot of these Chinese, Asian collectors, Singaporean, South Korean, they should empower rather than running around and buy expensive artworks from American artists. Even myself, I guess I put myself in there. Think about how can you, instead of building up these stupid museums, how can you, as a rich self, empower, the local curators, empower the local educators, so that instead, you have the Luma Foundation is another thing that should be eradicated also, because it's the Luma Foundation, in a very smart way, that was able to form a mafia and empower artists like Philip Perino, Pierre Wig, curators like Beatrice Roof, Hans Obritz, and to go around the world and do a second round of colonization. So I'm saying that individuals and young collectors here in Asia should think about models in which they can empower educators and artists in a local context. And it's going to take a long time. There's no quick fix situation.
And it will take work, obviously.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I think Wu you sort of expressed when you were working with the silver platter and working on Wildness, and really kind of coming to grips with the contradictions and the problematics of actually engaging in collective practice or an activist practice that actually tries to change or make space.
Yeah, actually, the phrase "moving forward" is so interesting to me, because I remember when I was doing interviews with a lot of the documentary subjects of Silver Platter, a lot of people said that's I think a part of a narrative. It's actually very familiar to me from my father. I think it's like in America, it's a very immigrant narrative of like, we need to move forward. So like, I don't have Chinese language because my dad was like, we're moving forward. We're here now. We're not looking
Progress.
back or something. And so I've always like kind of hated that idea of moving forward. But I think if I understand like the spirit of your question, I think maybe something I could add is just, I think, yeah, I think like actually the emotions of like fear and shame are really important ones that we all need to deal with, like just around like power and around like, just like not being afraid to allow other people to define their own, actually even not to empower people, because I think empowering people implies that you have the power to empower someone. So I don't know, to just stay in that space of uncomfortability about not knowing until you find out like what people want, which is something I try to do, which is also to do with time and slowness, because for example, being here in Hong Kong, I've been here for a year because it didn't feel like any less time would be appropriate to make any kind of like cultural gesture, I guess.
Lee, you're nodding in enthusiastic agreement, so I wonder if you could...
Yeah, because I was also going to pick on the question and be contentious, but it's exactly what you're saying, right? It's really hard to decolonize thinking outside of this kind of teleological, right? This linearity of time, moving past, post, pre, et cetera, but also just to say that one shouldn't underestimate the potential of how these things move. I mean, it's like we're talking about fluidity and contradiction, and it's like I've just met these folks, however, 40 minutes ago, and we're on stage drawing in our Nike sneakers, drinking tea, speaking in a Western feedback looped American English in my case, to an audience of folks in Hong Kong in this hall, in which next week there's going to be, like a dried fish convention that's way bigger than what's happening here now. And so I think, to sort of come back to your question, I think it's also, in a way, already happening, very much so. The 362 days that we are not on a stage at Basel, these minds and bodies and voices and conversations are highly active and constantly working, right? And so, there are so many things that are happening in each of our cases. And for me, it's like, I also just don't really want to tell anyone about it because it's already happening, and I am worried or anxious about what these folks are saying, about what happens as a consequence of revealing that. I think there's an expectation to think that, if a gaze isn't cast upon something that there isn't anything there happening. And I think, it's, so when you say, how do you move past, it's like, we're already, at least I speak from my context in Dubai, we're already way, way, way past this shit. Totally way past it.
Past what?
Past the idea of not being able to move past something, like already working elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's important to remind ourselves that the art fair should not be denied. This is, context should not be denied. The fact that potentially I might not see you again might not be denied. But I think this is almost like a kind of intervention. This hour that we are being allowed is almost like an intervention. An infiltration, and that infiltration, in a way, yes, but there's also I think this is being recorded somehow, so I think this is going to live on, and there's people making notes and so on, and this is going to go beyond this room, social media, etc., etc. So I think I'm saying let's not be coy, and really be conscious of the fact that, yes, I am an artist. Yes, I want to do museum shows and so on and so forth. But I think, it's bigger than that. It's really bigger than, we are in this cultural sphere. And I guess I'm saying, let's, perhaps I'm speaking solely or kind of exclusively in the context that I live and I move around in, which is primarily, European. I was lucky enough to be sheltered and shielded by an immigrant family of more or less 60 plus individuals since the age of 10 when I moved to London. So I don't really consider myself that I was, I am, I guess, a Londoner. I travel a lot. But given that shield, I was able to form a bridge, a cultural bridge. And I see examples of this coming together of artists. Maybe perhaps I'm being a bit too romantic, but I think, let's really get together and empower the other, and give us an opportunity. Perhaps, the five of us, six of us, including Yutaka, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, should, go forward from here and make things happen. I am an optimistic, but also dark at the same time. So, yes, it's this trying situation, but let's maybe use this opportunity almost as a renaissance.
Yeah, I think it's super important. There is a difference in the language because, talking about intervention and things, and I think we've tried that for a long time, kind of to rework institutions and make them work in a better way. We've sent a lot of super awesome people from our world into, the center of the art beast. Awesome people who came out of, Daphne Ayas and Rotterdam, Clara Tate now, like people are starting to bring this conversation that we're having into that, but it's also, you're never going to change the structural relationship of the way that that works. So I think, Oscar, one of the things that you're advocating for, in addition to getting rid of all that, is to actually build new institutions in different spaces, and not geographical spaces at all, but kind of that are built with this understanding of the way that things can be said, and that we can build them in a new way to allow each other to say different things and not the same things that we're just repeating over and over.
Right, exactly, because I mean, you know, when we're going to have and the necessity to have conversations like this is precisely to try and find ways to get out of the language that we have been forced or are just so conditioned to use, I think. But I feel like we've actually hit that moment where I think we might have time for one or two questions from the audience. One question from the audience. If there's one person who has a question, yes, right back there.
Hi, my question is for Mr. Murillo. I was just wondering, and you kind of touched on this briefly, but how you view yourself and your views in your position in the art world in light of being an artist who has been very heavily sponsored by the very institution which you are critiquing, and how you feel about that and how you want to sort of approach that moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, you're 100% right. Like I said, you know, I wouldn't have been here I wouldn't have been here had I been deported from Australia. Secondly, I wouldn't have been here, more importantly, had I not started working with a gallery like David Werner. Thirdly, I wouldn't been able to do the show that I did in New York. I mean, you sound like an American, right? And so I'm not denying that position, and I think it's a very important position. And like I said, given the fact that I have the position, I want to put it to good practice, and almost like a suicide bomber, you know, explode from within. So, like I was saying, almost like a suicide bomber, you know, the suicide bomber explodes from within. You know, I'm not condoning what they do, but it's a strategy that is effective. And so, you know, given the fact that I could go around collectors' homes and sit around with them and, you know, have dinners and so on and so forth, these are the places, you know, that are, you know, important. You know, let's forget about, you know, individuals like Hans Ulbricht running around, you know, showing face for an hour and so in a talk. No, I think I think I recognize the position that I have, and I want to empower, you know, what I think is important going forward. I want to propel it forward. I don't want to dwell on it. I'm not interested in the artist as you know, enriching myself personally. I want to be involved and produce the projects that I believe are important for our future. And I'm sure, you know, maybe 20 years from now, an individual on stage might be saying, get rid of Oscar Murillo. Maybe that's fine, that's what's necessary, or even sooner. But I think soon, you know, we have to be conscious. And you know, people might be critical of my auction results and the gallery that I show with in New York. And like someone told me in Rio when I was talking about Rio being one of those countries that still live in this quasi-colonial context where, you know, there's probably is the second country outside of Africa that has the biggest population of African descendants, and still behaves like if they were in the 18th century. You know, someone said, you know, don't you think you're biting the hand that's feeding you? I said, well, you know, I'm not here on holidays. I'm here to do work and to do research, and research, perhaps my research perhaps is moving around, staying in nice hotels, and going to collectors' homes to see, these beautiful paintings, sculptures that they buy, but it is within that context that one, is analytical and should be critical, because, these are the individuals of power. So I think it's a step-by-step process, but it needs to start now.
Just to what Robin was saying about this idea of building institutions, like alternative ones, I think that is a really important thing that I'm taking away from this conversation. Because actually, I've always, doing the activism that I've done, I've always kind of just been like, I don't need to direct my energy into organizing in the art world because, there's bigger issues or whatever out there that need my attention more urgently. But actually, I think it's actually really important that we organize within the art world. I really, honestly, I'm having that realization right now because, I don't know, I'm just thinking, actually, we were talking about a shared mentor, Greg Bordowitz, who was very involved in ACT UP in the 80s and 90s, and I remember him once saying something to me about, we never wanted to change the world, we just wanted to change, the world for ourselves. So, it wasn't about, making some external change of government or policy, it was really just about people getting together and making their worlds different for each other, and that had a sort of a ripple effect. And I actually think that that's something I'm taking away from this conversation. So.
And I think that's the perfect point to end. And I just want to thank you all for such a generous conversation. It wasn't easy, of course, but nothing ever is. We do have issues of LEAP. I do have to plug that. They're at the door. Feel free to take a copy, and thank you all for your attention as well and for your concentration. I hope you all took something away from this as well. So thank you. Thank you to everyone, and thank you also to the Art Basel team. This is the final Salon, so I just want to say thanks to the technical team and to the translators. You guys have been awesome. It's been hard, but we're done. Thank you.